this is the middle of the second day, or as we wrap up this great event. How many people were in the Open Compute Hardware session yesterday? Yeah. All right, so this is the second session. Yesterday was an overview of how companies are using open hardware and the need that open software deserves open hardware. This session is going to be focused primarily on one aspect of open hardware, which is the most prevalent and the most growing area that we're experiencing within open hardware, which is the open networking space, and how financial services can quickly adapt open concepts across the networking piece. And to really get into the meat of the matter, I want to introduce Pete Crocker from Cumulus Networks, and he is a systems engineer based here and has a wealth of knowledge and a team with him here. And I'm going to hand it over to Pete. And
excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon is when we start talking about open hardware, you need software to run on top of that. We're going to dive a little bit here into the networking space. So let's start off with who here in the room has anything to do with infrastructure, switches, servers, anything like that? Excellent, kind of. What about application development side? That a little bit there, okay. Excellent. Quite a varied crowd. So this is then this is going to be a bit of a education for you on essentially how do you get the infrastructure side of the house actually working here. So for about the last 10 years, the various financial services companies have been keeping up with the growth of applications and services on their network. But here in the very recent past, things have kind of changed a bit. Essentially, there's new various projects and open source technologies that are really pushing the teams that run your infrastructure and network to have to deal with significantly more scale. So as opposed to hundreds or thousands of changes a month, they're now being forced to deal with thousands of changes a week. Right, everything's now, you can spin up a virtual machine automatically on the fly, you can spin up new services on the fly, you've got all these technologies like Docker rolling out everywhere, and essentially the pressure put onto the teams running the infrastructures is so great that they have to figure out new ways of dealing with this, right? You can't hire additional headcount to deal with exponential growth. And financially, it just doesn't make sense for these teams because oftentimes one of the biggest expenditures around this is the OpEx, right? Paying the people's salaries who run the infrastructure and networks around this. So essentially, every one of these companies is being forced now to figure out a new way of adapting to these greater demands happening on it. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about essentially being open here when it comes to infrastructure and networking. So traditionally you would go to one of the big companies to go buy your servers, your switches, your networking routers and devices, and you would certainly pay premium, right? You could go to the likes of Cisco, for example, and everybody considers that a nice, safe choice at the expense of essentially it costing a fair amount of premium to do that. And then typically you end up going down a path where you're locked into the vendor's specific choices in the matter, and which means from a procurement standpoint, you have a lot less flexibility to be able to drive down costs. You have a lot less choice in the market, and you're also then tied to their specific way of doing things, their tools, their monitoring solutions, automation, etc. So essentially where open hardware and open software comes into this is breaking up that model, right? And this is all based around essentially the concept of disaggregation. So disaggregation is something you're all familiar with, but it's relatively new in the networking space. when you go and you want to set up a server, right, you buy your server hardware from one company, and you go and you buy Windows or Linux from a completely different company. And we've been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years, right? This is the norm. However, when it comes to network infrastructure, you're still essentially buying both those pieces, the hardware and the software, from the same company. You go to a Cisco, Juniper, Arista, Huawei, and they'll sell you both parts of that. And so you're essentially locked into, right, a hardware choice and a software choice to go along with that. And essentially disaggregation is splitting those two concepts apart, going out and being able to choose whatever hardware option you want from a wide market of open hardware choices, and then going out to the market and choosing a network operating system, right, the software that runs on the networking devices, for whatever best meets your needs. And there's a market out there of various solutions. Some of them are completely open source and non-supported solutions. Some of them are open source with commercial support solutions, like what Cumulus does, for example. So that alone, right, when we talk about TCO costs, being able to simply go out there and choose different hardware choices is a huge CapEx savings for all these companies. And oftentimes it's not even the price of the box itself. Every time you need to connect a server, you've got to put a little optical transceiver inside of them, they're called. And the cost of every single one of those little transceivers that you need to connect every one of your servers oftentimes is a big, huge cost. If you have to go to the likes of the big guys to get it, then they often do 200, 300, 400% markup on those. If you can go generically out to the market to do these things with all the open hardware choices, then these things cost a fraction. There are oftentimes you're talking about 75% plus savings on the cost of these. So having that ability to go out there and do this from a CapEx standpoint alone easily justifies this. And I'll go ahead and go in and give you some examples of that here in just a moment. Essentially what you're getting here is not only we'll talk about both CapEx and OpEx savings essentially for going for open hardware, open software choices in this space, but also choice. Right? Choice here is you can go out and choose to bid to multiple different vendors and have them fight it out for how much the hardware costs in this space. You may want some specialized hardware that's being developed by OCP to solve some solution, and you don't want to have to go pay a particular vendor for the cost of those things. And frankly, essentially not being locked into any given company, right? You are back in the position of being able to drive your decisions based on what's best for the company and its goals, not what's best for essentially a single vendor out there. And then there's a lot of technical advantages as well from this stuff. It's all open, this is all well-worn path, and so when it comes to trying to scale these things up and do automation, time to market, there's a lot of benefits we can talk about as well at the end of this. But just by way of giving a little bit of examples here from a CapEx standpoint, this is just looking at a few numbers for how much it costs to go out there and buy a network switch, right? So what you have is you've got a network, you've got a load of servers sitting somewhere inside a data center, and you may have, let's say, up to 48 servers connected to a network switch. So you'll have loads and loads of these network switches inside the infrastructure. And for most people, essentially, this is the plumbing, right? But it's absolutely crucial plumbing, but as long as it works, nobody cares about it. And so businesses are hesitant to spend so much money on effectively, this plumbing type system that really doesn't do anything other than connect things. It's not adding value. It's not an application. It's not a service you're offering to your customers, but it is an absolutely necessary part of this. And so effectively, being able to go out and commoditize the prices of these brings down tremendously how much you're talking about paying for this crucial infrastructure. So this alone, right, just the cost of these solutions is easily justifies going towards open hardware choices. Essentially what you're seeing here is, as I said, the cost of the hardware, the cost of the optics on these things. The open software price of this is kind of negligible in some of the overall costs when you scale this stuff up. It's really the cost of the optics that add up when you're talking about doing this for thousands and thousands of servers and applications.
So the cost of the software is much higher, then you've got $0 for support. Assuming you want support, is some of that included in the OS price here? Is that...
Yeah, exactly. Basically, your support on this is included. This is for the, so there's multiple vendors in this space of providing the network operating system here. And our approach is essentially throw in support for 3 years for free. And perpetual licenses around this, right? So there's a lot of ways that you can get locked in, right? Licensing costs and add-ons and various bits like that. And essentially we're taking much as simple an approach as possible to make this easy for people to justify purchasing it, as well as technically roll this stuff out as well.
Can you explain, a lot of people miss out on the cost of the optics. I know you mentioned it. The fact that when you put the optics into the switch, the value of the optics, the cost of the optics is considerably more than the cost of the switch. Now, you're showing now at $21,000 against $7,000, but when you've got something that's really intense on optics, like you would have for a switch in a data center, that figure is there's a much bigger differential. I've seen like 85% reductions.
Yeah.
And I think people need to get that in their head, that when you've got intense optics, the price really, there's a real big differential.
Yeah, technically what you have here is a switch with ports for all the servers, and every one of those ports needs what's called an optic. And those optics are, sometimes a few $100s each. And when you start doing that at 48 optics per switch, and you start doing this at thousands and thousands of servers, right? The price of the server, the price of the the price of the switch, the price of the network operating system is, in some ways, irrelevant when these. I've got Scott here from one of our open compute partners here, and he's helping put together a quote for a customer rolling out essentially about 1,000 servers, 1,000 switches, and the price, as you said, John, of the optics on this are just absolutely massive.
To this, so when we're doing this exercise and we're rolling this out, the customers bought into open switching, so they've gone with Cumulus for the NOS networking operating system. And the benefit at the point was, yeah, the switches are going to save us money, but we're now working with them around the transceivers, as you say. It's like 7,000 transceivers, and the cost of those transceivers are just. Well, when you start talking about those multiples, and you can go out to market to pretty much anybody to ask them for what kind of cost, and you obviously got to check the quality of those things. They start here, and then it just goes down, and it's amazing where it finishes as to what the real cost of these switches are. So, again, we're saving them money. This customer, going back to them saying, look, I've got you a lot less than where you thought you could get. But what we're also seeing now is that they've got a requirement for 12,500 servers. So those 12,500 servers initially are another brand, and where we're coming from is a completely different, similar place from these guys with ODMs, original design manufacturers. Those guys know where the future of DCs are going to look like, and they're changing their build. So essentially they need less transceivers because the ports that come out of these servers are completely differently designed. So they don't need as many transceivers because they appreciate that servers out in the market at the moment are asking for them, but you can design internally slightly different. You only need maybe one transceiver against 4.
These transceivers are the optics that he keeps talking about.
And it's also your cables that add on to that. It all adds up, and it all adds up in the data center, but you never get the true picture until you've done that full exercise. And all we're doing is demonstrating that we can save them an awful lot of money. But that isn't how you open any kind of technical conversation with anybody. But it's one of those flags you kind of got to fly to say, hey, this is really, really innovative in what it does technology-wise, but I'm also going to drive your costs down massively, because you're moving away from those traditional OEM brands who have had you on the drug for years, and you're trying to say that there's a different way. But it's very hard to change your mindset to say, let's go with this, because it feels a little bit uncertain. But the market is definitely changing. We've been doing this for 3 years, and we're just seeing people taking the first steps of exploring it, because essentially they realise what Facebook and Google have been doing for years, and they didn't do it for no reason. And now it's starting to just trickle into telco, into enterprise, into you guys, into finance, and it just makes sense. You know, it's not a hard. I'm not selling. It's only kind of introducing concepts that are out there that people have got to explore. So that's me flying my open strategy flag. I think it's a good idea.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So that's only part of it. When it comes to OpEx, this is oftentimes where really you see the savings over time on this. As I mentioned before, what's happening is the teams that you have in place essentially to run your infrastructure are now having to deal with exponential growth around them, right? Everybody wants to spin stuff up virtually on the fly. They want it set up here within minutes and hours. They don't want to wait 2 weeks to have their latest service or application rolled out to add value to your business. And the budget spend for most of these companies is mostly around essentially paying the salaries of the IT professionals for this. You're not going to get additional headcount to handle this additional load, so you have to start moving towards methods of automation around this, right? You have to start moving from having one single person running dozens of servers and having them start managing hundreds of servers to be able to actually keep up with this type of scale. And of course, all the business units inside your company are all demanding that these things now happen basically instantly, right? They're used to essentially this Google lifestyle where you click a button and something all of a sudden just works, and they don't know the magic that goes on behind the scenes to do that. But that's the expectation, basically, is the IT teams can move at that kind of pace. And so moving over towards automating those business practices and the technical needs there are quite challenging, but essentially that's where you get the major OpEx savings for these companies. It's a challenge. It takes companies typically a few years to kind of start this journey and ultimately get to the point of automating much of this infrastructure. But at the end of this, essentially then they're leveraging massive scale and doing what all the big web scale companies are doing, but just doing it at much smaller scale. So same concepts. You don't need to be any one of the biggest companies out there to take advantage of all this automation. You can be a small organization with 20 people and still get the same benefits from this. We'll talk a little bit about that here, though. Okay, so let's talk very brief history here, right? So way back in the days, you had mainframes, right, dominating. You had very simple applications running on those mainframes, but very, very complex infrastructure to handle those mainframes. And then in the 90s, right, PCs started getting put on every single desktop, and so you had client-server based applications typically happening here, and a business function would come in and say, I want to run some given application. They'd set it up on a server somewhere, and the IT teams would run around and figure out all the specifics of that given application, as complex as it was, and figure out the infrastructure necessary to put in place to be able to run those business applications. What's been happening here recently, right? You hear all these people talking about Webscale IT. And essentially what at the heart of some of this is trying to do is to try and simplify the infrastructure as much as possible so that these complex applications you have running your businesses can take advantage of a highly scalable, easy to roll out infrastructure to go along with it. So Webscale really doesn't mean anything other than trying to simplify the infrastructure as much as possible, to leverage as much automation as possible, to essentially lower the OpEx spend around your IT departments around this, and have them keep up with the type of scale that the business groups are asking of them. And if we look back in time, what we had is, for many, many years in this industry, you had big companies like Cisco, EMC, VMware that would develop solutions of how to roll out these infrastructures. And they'd preach their stories to essentially all the financials, and the financials would take those solutions provided to them by the big guys and roll those out, right? A very vendor-specific solution. And that's essentially how they kept up with the growth happening in the financial services industry for really about the last 10, 15 years now. And so much of the rest of the industries around that looked to essentially the financials as a model of how to do things, right? How can I, as a medium-sized enterprise, as a retailer, distributor, keep up with my type of scale? I'm going to learn the lessons that the likes of the financials have used to deal with their level of scale, and I just don't have to go as far to do it. But that essentially was the model. Now, these days, people are essentially turning to the Webscale companies as a model for, regardless of how large your organization is, the Webscale companies essentially had to rethink how do we roll out this infrastructure. The models previously being locked into vendor solutions can't keep up with our scale, and much of that learning is essentially now trickling down, right? So Facebook's developments around open hardware are a great example of that, right? All the lessons essentially they've learned are now available to everyone out there. A lot of the open software code that's out there to do large-scale databases and automation and other solutions is essentially now all freely available for all of you to take advantage of as well. And it doesn't matter essentially what your level of scale is. All of these solutions are typically applicable and useful for organizations to roll out. Now, this is probably the most interesting part of this is infrastructure heroics, right? So this is, where did my, there it goes. This is essentially the biggest shift we've seen here. So back in the day, taking various financial services companies as a perfect example of this. If you look at the amount of money that they spend on different parts of their infrastructure, so on the left-hand side over there, right, ultimately what you're trying to do is run an application, right? You've got business applications that are the heart of the business, right? That's either for internal customers or maybe for external customers, right? And that's where all of the value is. All the rest of that is spend that is necessary to essentially deliver those applications. And what the Webscale companies effectively have tried to figure out is how can we start minimizing those other areas? So compute, right? By compute, what we mean is there's a server sitting somewhere running an application. That's where all the value is to your company. So the more that you can spend your budget on actually being able to deliver applications, then the more value the business is essentially getting and the less overhead there is along with this. And effectively what they've figured out is, as opposed to hiring increasingly hiring very, very smart people and spending all this OpEx by having humans manually manage this type of process, they've figured out how to automate as much of this as possible, right? This networking piece where I live my life in, this is effectively plumbing to them, right? Necessary. Everyone complains when the network breaks. But if the network's working fine, then nobody wants to know, care, or talk about that part of this, right? It's not per se delivering value to the end customers, it just has to work. So the lessons really learned from this are that if you can figure out how to move your business to automating as much of this as possible and taking advantage of the various open source solutions out there, the lessons that have been learned from some of these larger companies, then you can effectively drive down some of those OpEx costs. So on that point, if you look at various other parts of the IT industry, right, they've been moving towards models of openness for years, for decades. When it comes to the networking space, it seemed for most people this is a relatively newer concept, but this is essentially inevitable, right? Facebook, EdgeCore, various companies have gone out there and essentially developed open source hardware solutions. You can go out to the market and take advantage of these commodity switches from a wide number of different companies these days. You can take advantage of the optical transceiver costs going down. That's all happening. And you're actually seeing as well some of the larger companies in this space being forced into going open by their customers. Their customers are demanding that. They don't want to be locked in anymore either. And especially in your area here, right, how much you're spending on those various different parts there of compute and networking and operations translates effectively to profitability for your businesses. And the more that you're in control of that overall technical infrastructure as opposed to having various vendors make those decisions for you, then the better you can align with your business goals on this. Okay, so I do have a few bits in here to essentially talk about the technical side of this, but given the audience that we're talking about in here, I'm going to go ahead and skip through that. But I will put one bit in here. Open. I'm going to make sure it looks like it was trying to automatically fast forward for me. There we go. Open does not just mean going out and getting open hardware from a given company, open software solutions from a given company. There's a lot more to being open than just those two parts of this, right? A lot of the value from this actually is being in control of your destiny. And there's a lot of various different parts of this, right? From automation to security response parts of this, right? So effectively being able to instantly get a security patch and not have to wait days, weeks, or months for a given vendor that you're reliant on to fix these solutions around this, to automation of rollout, to even the tricks that these companies play with licensing on it, right? Oh, you need that feature? Then we're going to charge you extra for that. Oh, you need to add one more box into this, or you need to worry about sparing and hardware failures, then, oh, those are all various costs associated with these things. So there's many other parts to this than just simply having an open hardware design, and you definitely need to take some of those into account when looking at this. So finally, what I'll just talk about here is just to give some real-world examples from this. I've got two customers here. So everyone knows Chase. Chase did a massive rollout with us here last year. And essentially, they went from being a 100% Cisco environment to essentially moving towards open hardware and open software solutions for their data centers. And so you're talking about thousands and thousands of networking devices, right? So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of servers that are running in this worldwide infrastructure to be able to provide all their applications worldwide. And the upfront costs, right, 45%, those are hard numbers to essentially deny from an upfront CapEx savings cost of it. But really for them, what the value was is the ongoing OpEx savings. Automation of all the business practices, ultimately driving down the cost. And for the various engineers involved in this, what it means is they're not stuck in the mundane. They actually get to use their brains for solving the bigger company problems and aren't just doing the various moves, adds, changes, and reacting to various troubleshooting problems and failures. So you're elevating your highly intelligent staff as well back to what they should be used for.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Is this a projection or is this a project?
These are all measured numbers actually from this one that I've got references on this one. I can dive into detail on this one.
How long ago did they start this process, and how did they actually begin the open networking side of things? So how long has this been?
I can talk probably more about this one on that one because I'm closer to this one. So as another example here, there was a large Dutch bank that went through essentially as they learned how to automate different parts of their infrastructure, they started turning to actually the network. And they realized that their existing incumbent vendors weren't very strong when it came to automating. And so they went out to the market. They discovered essentially the whole world of open hardware choices out there and open network operating system choices. And they essentially made decisions not on the financial savings side of this, so much as they knew that they would see financial savings certainly from the upfront cost of all these devices. But they knew that the OpEx side of it, the automation side of this, is really where they were going to see the key savings. So essentially they spent about 4 or 5 months going through the testing of this. So setting up all the various hardware, running all their key business applications through all of this to make sure that the hardware would work, running through all the failure cases necessary to make sure that it was going to be as reliable as their existing infrastructure on this. And in the process of doing that, they essentially learned how to work with this new vendor and do the automation side of this. So at the end of this, essentially, they were all trained. They'd already figured out how to effectively roll this stuff out at scale by all the lessons they learned through the trialing of this. And they're now rolling out effectively, with these guys, it was 14,000 hosts in a single data center, and they rolled that out within a few months, effectively the networking portion of this. So things that typically would be like 2-year projects are now being done in 3 to 6 months. And I think one of my colleagues actually made a point on this. One of our customers said to us recently that money sometimes is not the biggest driver here, right? You can dig up budget sometimes for key projects going on, but oftentimes what the businesses cannot get back is time, right? If it takes you 2 years to get a project done, right, then effectively you've lost various people towards that project. If you can bring that time down to 3 to 6 months, right, that's an invaluable part of this that cannot be sorted out any other way. So being able to move projects along, roll things out at scale, easily spin up new parts of the infrastructure to deal with a new business need, right? The time savings from that was actually what one of our customers said was the biggest motivation to move towards this. Okay. With that in mind, essentially, the various parts of this, Cumulus is effectively we're a company that is making open source software and effectively tying support around this, because crucial parts of the infrastructure, you want to be able to pick up the phone and call someone when it breaks. But pretty much everything that we do is doing open source development on this. All of our software runs on all the various open compute hardware choices, and there's all kinds of other open hardware choices out on the market on that. And we've got various partners here kind of all across the board to be able to provide those various hardware choices. So with that, any questions?
I do want to say just a
Yeah,
bit,
please, Steve.
One thing about Cumulus. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to think that a software company would be part of the open hardware community itself. But these guys are not only members, but they're platinum members, meaning that they're actually contributing back into the overall foundation. One of their primary principal architects sits on our leadership board. So we have that leadership slide that I showed yesterday. There's around a dozen or so on our technical leadership incubation committee. And one of their colleagues leads the networking division with a gentleman from Facebook. So they're not only just contributors, but they're actually setting the direction on the open networking side. And we're really, really excited about all the stuff that they've been doing and look forward to more of these type of stories. So any questions around open networking? All right, yeah.
I guess, a lot of the presentation was talking about the OpEx and the improvements there. How do you think the commercial companies are going to respond, if that's a software feature, is it usability that what do you think causes that OpEx reduction?
You can talk to how the commercial companies are.
So there's a few things already going on this. You take some of the large guys here, right? Cisco, Juniper, Arista have all made announcements about disaggregation, right? Separating their hardware and software. Their customers are forcing them into this. And the amount of seriousness to take from that varies, and it will be seen, I think, here over the coming years about how much they're really actually buying into the value of that separation of hardware and software versus actually just doing it to check mark, some RFP or something like that. So I don't think I don't think customers are seeing a lot of value from their announcements yet from that standpoint. But I think the other side of this actually is when you actually get into the details of trying to automate this infrastructure, which is where you're seeing a lot of value from this, effectively having all this stuff based on open source, effectively Cumulus it's Linux. All of you guys basically live in a world where everything's running on Linux. Everyone's doing this at massive scale with thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of Linux boxes running everywhere. It's a very, very well-worn path. And what it means is that when you move towards automation, you can trust the various tools and open source projects that everyone's using because there's thousands or millions of other people doing this daily from that standpoint. So when you go towards a specific vendor and start looking at automation, you're typically looking at a niche area of automating, some given specific product out there, as opposed to automating Linux, where everybody's doing this at massive scale.
If I can just add something in the commercial space of all the big vendors that it's quite interesting if you look. One of the hardware manufacturers of this open source hardware is called Acton. Most of you have never heard of them, but they're like an $8 billion business. And what was interesting, I saw a lovely slide the other day of when they got into the open source. Since they did that a few years ago, their sales have doubled every single year on year, doubling. And what's interesting, there's a strategy now in Cisco. They are massively trying to reduce their hardware. So by the end of this decade, they do not want to be having more than 50% of their revenues in hardware because they can't make any money at it anymore, and they're acquiring software services businesses in order to keep their growth, which looks like they're growing at 2% per annum. And the only way they're keeping there is because they're buying the software services businesses, because all the world's telcos have dropped this proprietary kind of way of doing things. Brocade, big switch manufacturer, went bust. Effectively, they got bought out and stripped down a year and a half ago. It's really great what's happening. It's really exciting.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your time here. Yep.